Hey everybody, it's Bella Deadwood. Sorry for the late post. This week's stories are all about creepy encounters. I had noticed some other storytellers were putting in their own stories, asking people to guess them. And while that is a bit of a fun game, I always post the links in the description, so I won't bother making you guess this time. Anyway, without further ado, I hope you enjoy the stories. When I was about 7 years old, I lived on the outskirts of London in a standard suburban area. My house faced a busy road with shops, a church, and an old folks' home. Despite the fact I was this little kid, my parents didn't much care where I went during the day, as long as I was back for dinner. In fact, my brother and I were discouraged to come back before then. It was the late 90s, but they weren't too worried about anything happening to us, even though we were gone all day. It was the summer holidays, and I was planning to take myself down to the library near the park. To get there, I had to walk down a busy road, past the church, the pub, and the social club. My mother was asleep on the sofa at the time, as she was pretty much every day, so I didn't ask permission to go out. I packed myself a lunch, including a flask full of milk, and went. A few minutes into my walk, I was stopped by a man sitting on the wall of the churchyard, dressed in a denim jacket despite the heat. He looked unclean, even to my 7-year-old eyes. His teeth were yellow, going black around the gums. He was unshaven, and his hair was a mess. Despite this, it didn't smell too bad. So when he called to me, I stopped. "What are you drinking?" he asked me. He had a nice voice, with an accent I couldn't place. Irish, now that I think about it. "That's a big cup for a little girl. What's in it?" Being the idiot I was, I replied, "Milk." "I love milk," he said, "and I'm thirsty. Can I have some?" Instead of being creeped out, I was more concerned about his dirty teeth touching my pink plastic flask. It was my favorite, and I didn't want him drinking from it. It took me a while to answer. I was a passive kid. Didn't always have the confidence to tell people no. But I must have shaken my head. "Go on," he said. "I'll get you some more if you let me have some now. There's some at my house, but it takes a while to get there. You can come with me. Do you live near here?" I kept shaking my head, frozen to the spot. He kept asking in a soft, pleading voice, trying to convince me. He told me I was cute and asked how old I was, and he kept asking for some of my milk. That was the last straw. I didn't want to go anywhere with this guy, and I sure as hell didn't want to give him anything of mine. I started walking away, ignoring his calls after me. The park wasn't far away, and there would be women there with their kids. I didn't want to go back home. Mom usually didn't answer the door if I rattled the letterbox. I started walking away, trying not to look over my shoulder. I didn't know about stranger danger, but I did know this guy was scary, and I didn't like him. I wanted to run, but for some reason I didn't. It's stupid now, when I think about it. I was on a busy street. Anyone would have helped me. When I turned the corner into the park, I saw him following a little way behind. Legging it to the park, I ran straight for the sound of kids yelling in the playground. I threw open the gate and grabbed the first adult I laid eyes on. I told them about the creeper asking for my drink and pointed him out, skulking at the park entrance. He saw people looking and walked off, vanishing around the corner. A few parents gathered around me, talking to each other. Apparently, this guy was well known, and they'd chase him off from talking to their children, too. He can't have been all that clever, trying to get at me in the middle of the street and using milk as a lure, of all things. But the memory of him still creeps me out. I don't know what would have happened if I'd been stupid enough to go with him. And he didn't get any of my goddamn milk. Last week, an old friend dropped by. We were sitting in his car in front of my house having a cigarette and talking about good old days. After a few minutes, we noticed a disheveled-looking woman walking up the street towards an abandoned apartment building that's kitty corner to my house. I live in a pretty quiet neighborhood on a dead-end street, so nothing really ever happens around here, and I didn't think much about her. We sat there, just watching as she walked around the outside of the apartment. I still didn't think much about it, even though the electricity to the building had been shut off and no one had lived in the building for years. I figured that maybe she was a new tenant and was getting the place ready to move in. Finally, she quit walking around the outside and disappeared into a screened-in porch. A few minutes later, an equally disheveled man came walking up the street and lingered around the outside a few minutes before entering the same porch. I joked with my friend that I hoped he wasn't a murderer. And then he came outside and began filling a 5-gallon bucket with water. I still didn't think that they were acting too suspicious. I figured the water was off inside. He was using the bucket to flush the toilet. Time passed, and we forgot about the weirdos. When all of a sudden the woman rushed out of the apartment and started walking directly at us. I tossed my cigarette out the window, told my buddy to roll the windows up. It was dark out at this point, and his windows were tinted, so I figured we could just ignore her. As she got closer, I could see that she was filthy and her hands were shaking. I assumed she was methed out or cracked out. She probably was. She got within a few feet of the front of his car. She made a sharp turn and walked over to an empty field across the street from my house and just stared into the darkness for what seemed like a minute or two. Somehow we lost sight of her for a moment, and when I turned back around, the next thing I know, her face was pressed up against the passenger window right next to me. I almost pissed myself. She just stared at me and said, "Hello? Hello? I can see you in there." She stood by the side of the car for about a minute and then walked back to the apartment. She got back to the front door. The man opened it for her, and they both stood on the porch, staring in our direction. There was no light, except for a single candle burning behind them. Both of us were pretty creeped out, so we just sat there, speechless, watching the apartment. About 10 minutes later, the pair walked out the front door and went down the road in the direction they arrived from. I haven't seen them since, but the next morning I noticed the screen on the porch had been ripped out, and the door was left ajar. I called the police non-emergency number to report the open door, and haven't heard anything back. I'm sure that they were just a couple of crackhead squatters, but it still gave me the creeps. This last story is my own. Now, it is quite a personal story, and seeing as I haven't actually written it down, This is probably the 10th or 11th time I've tried recording this. This all happened when I was about 9 or 10, at most 11. I lived with my mom. We had about a half an acre of land, with what would be a 60-year-old house now in the front of the property, and a much newer house in the back, a grandmother's cottage of sorts. In that grandmother's cottage lived a boy. My mom let him live back there. He was a bit odd. I recall going in there to play video games with him at some point. His room would stink. Not just sweaty socks or regular boy smell, but just stank. I had noticed at one point that he had written on the wall in his own blood. I didn't know what it said. He had copied some kanji out of a book of his. I didn't know what it meant, but that dried blood on the wall, it made me not want to ever go back. Anyway, I lived in the main house with my mom and her boyfriend and her boyfriend's son. My room had a fairly large window. It took up most of the wall. I remember that day I decided to open up the curtains. Normally I kept them shut just because I didn't want the neighbors across the street to look in. I was cleaning my room when I heard a knock on my door and heard the door open up directly after. I looked up, and it was the boy that lived behind us. He seemed nervous, like he was feeling guilty and wanted to do something, but knew it was wrong. He stepped in. I asked him what's up. Kind of alarmed that he was in my room, but not really worried. More shocked than anything that he just came in. He was wringing his hands. He looked at me and said, "Do you remember that you promised when you developed breasts that you would let me touch them?" I was taken aback, startled, and I felt my blood run cold. I never remember making this promise to him. And although I was developing quite early, I still didn't really know what it meant. I knew it wasn't good though. I shook my head. No, I don't remember that promise. He took a step forward and said, "Well, you promised, so..." He took another step. I shook my head again and said, "No, I don't think I promised that. And if I did, that's a promise I'm gonna have to break." I shrugged, as if that would make him leave. He looked at me and said, "You promised, though. You should keep your promises. Just let me touch your breasts." This boy wasn't a whole lot older than me, but he was bigger. I felt my heart racing and just kept shaking my head. No, if I made that promise, I have to break it. I don't think that made my promise. I don't think I made that promise. Eventually, he got tired of me just saying no and came at me. Before I could even register, I had started running. I ran past him toward my door, and I could feel his arm slip around my waist, trying to stop me. Like I said, I wasn't very big, but I must have been going pretty fast. He couldn't get a grip. I ran out of the house. I know it seems stupid, but I ran and hid behind the grandmother's cottage he was living in. There was some lumber and some stacks of styrofoam or maybe steel, I can't recall. And I hid between them. I was crying. I lived in that house up until my 13th birthday, when I had moved out and lived with my dad. My mom was pretty neglectful, so though she did see some of these advances, she never did anything about it. I don't like thinking about what would have happened if he had gotten a grip around my waist while I was running. Hey everybody, thank you for watching my video. I'm thinking next week I might try doing some creepypastas. Let me know what you think in the comments. And as always, if you have any suggestions to make these videos better, or what to read in my next videos, leave a comment down below. And for now, I'll leave you with your nightmares. Goodbye, guys.